So in order to honor today's anniversary, 131st anniversary of the passing of the beloved Mo'i Kalākaua, I would like to give this presentation to to put some shed some light on I think a very important aspect of King Kalākaua's legacy, and especially on his policy to unify Oceania, because that really, if you really think about it, I think that's probably the most important of King Kalākaua's legacy and of his, like, probably the one aspect of his policy that he was most passionate about. So let's just go like a little bit over what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So first of all, I will just go a little bit and give some background about what was Hawaii's position in the Pacific, just in general. Secondly, about the work of King Kalākaua's predecessors towards the unification of Oceania, because Kalākaua didn't entirely build it all by himself. He pretty much picked up and took it to the next level where his predecessors had done already a lot of work. And then third, we will look to the contributions during the first part of Kalākaua's reign, like before his trip to the world, his early reign, what he did there, which is probably the least known actually. And then fourth, the kind of the culmination when there was the Hawaiian Renaissance at home and the so-called new departure policy. I'll explain that in a little bit what I mean by that in its foreign policy. And then fifth, the then implementing Oceania's unification on the ground, which is really like the first big kind of diplomatic mission into another island of Oceania that King Kalākaua commissioned. And then finally, we will look a little bit about the legacy, about the epilogue, like kind of how this all ended, unfortunately, during his reign, and then, but also the legacy on how some of that lives on today, and some of this can be picked up today again. Okay, so first of all, look at Hawaii's position in the Pacific. So what is interesting, of course, is that we need to all understand that, Hawaii is not like, it's not an appendix of North America somewhere lost in the Southwest, like, unfortunately, most American maps presented today, but it is actually an archipelago in the center of the Northern Pacific. And the kind of natural view from Hawaii is to just see, like, look to both seaboards of the Pacific and see Hawaii in the center. And that's exactly how people during the kingdom saw it, and that's how they represented themselves, or represented their country in their maps that they produced during the kingdom. This is probably, I think, the first Pacific map that was printed in Hawaii. This is part of the 1840 Lahaina Luna School Atlas. And actually, interestingly enough, it starts with that map. That's like, if you open it, as the very first map is that one. And only then you get to the Hawaiian Islands. And then later you get to other continents, America, Asia, Europe, Africa, and so on. But really, like, before you even go to the Hawaiian Islands, you see like its location in what they refer to in Maka'olelo, Hawaii as Ka'aina or Na'aina Moana, the island, or the lands, actually literally the land of the sea, or the sea land, the ocean land, or the ocean lands. So you see, it's kind of the same, I guess, in a way, a very similar word, like the word Oceania in English, right? Like a kind of a land or continent that is based on the ocean, because obviously in the Pacific, most of the mass of the body of this Oceanian continent is actually water and not land. So yeah, that's a Hawaiian view from the 19th century, but equally interesting is to look at outside views, especially non-American ones, but European ones during that time, which, very curiously actually, back up that same view. So this is a map I found because I'm German, so I did some research in German publications and archives and so on. So this is a map that was done in 1859. So yeah, just 19 years later than the other one. Given the long time of communications, pretty much right during, shortly after, one may say. And it's a map of Polynesia and of, actually of the entire Pacific, like the Große Ozean, the Great Ocean. And it shows all the major powers that have possessions in the Pacific. Of course, not as many yet as at the late 19th century. So we still have a lot of Pacific islands that are not claimed or not colonized. But of course, we have already here, we have the, in Australia, New Zealand, India, the British possessions, right? We have the French are already in Tahiti and in New Caledonia. The Spanish are still in the Philippines and in Guam. Then the Dutch, the Netherlands are here in what's now Indonesia. We have Russia all the way here in the north. Of course, Russia at that time is still possessing Alaska. They haven't sold that to the United States yet. And then but if you look at it, there's 6 of these Western powers who are starting to colonize the region. By the way, there's also American possessions here. These are the so-called Guano Act Islands. These are small uninhabited atolls that American merchants claim to mine guano. So that's another episode of American imperialism that's not well known, but it also, I guess, wasn't as consequential as the later wave in the 1890s. But like just to point out that the US was already had some interest in the Pacific as early as that. Anyway, so but back to these colors here. So there are like these 6 European or Western powers that have like started to colonize the Pacific. But there is a 7th power of the Pacific here, and that is called Reich Kamehameha. So now Reich Kamehameha in German means as much approximately means the empire of the Kamehamehas. So that's the way that German cartographers saw Hawaii. It was like the empire of the Kamehamehas, one of the, maybe the smallest, but nonetheless one of the 7 powers in the Pacific that were at equal rank to the European powers. Which of course, entirely is in sync with the narrative that, you've heard probably before about Hawaii being like, the first and only non-Western country to be fully recognized. Here again, we have, besides the legal documents that we know, we have here just a cartographic evidence of that as well. And interestingly enough, other, powers in Asia, like China and Japan here, they are not marked. I mean, they're called Reich, like Chinesisches Reich, like Chinese Empire, but they're not marked, they're not color-coded because they are not, at that point, they are not recognized by the Western powers as independent states, whereas Hawaii is. So that's like probably a very, one of the most explicit document that, that graphically shows like, the Hawaii's special status as being the only recognized country and also being like a power in the Central Pacific. So keeping that in mind, we have during that same time the beginning of a policy from emanating from the Hawaiian Kingdom to unify Oceania. And so this idea is maybe not the very first time, but certainly in the first kind of time coherently articulated, actually by a Hawaiian diplomat. Who was based in Sydney in what is now Australia, back then the British colonies, and he by the name of Charles St. Julian, and that's the gentleman on the upper right of this slide. And he wrote, he communicated back with Honolulu, and he wrote a policy paper essentially in the 1850s, where he said that, well, Hawaii, it's really Hawaii's obligation or kuleana to create a confederation of all the remaining, or like all the still independent or non-colonized Pacific Island nations, and create a confederation. And then if this confederation happens, it will be, and then I quote him, a power in the world. And he adds, not just in a symbolic sense, but in the actual sense, right? So there's this idea that if all this Aina Moana, if all this Pacific space becomes unified under, like, under Hawaii, that's really when it can be really a power, a significant power. And so this policy then continues. So this was, of course, during the reigns of Kamehameha III and Kamehameha V in the 50s, and then later under Kamehameha V. He continued that policy, and again had 2 advisors that were like instrumental in that, who were like also developing this idea further and assessing how this could be implemented. And these were these 2 European advisors that were both ministers of foreign affairs at one point, Charles de Varigny, a Frenchman, and Charles Harris, who was originally from Boston, I think. So he was American originally, but not part of this missionary descendant crew that would later like conspire. But like he was certainly loyal to the kingdom. So yeah, this kind of that's the that's the history before, like what was there in the inner circuit of the kingdom. Now, of course, we come to King Kalākaua, and of course, with King Kalākaua, it is interesting that he was, he was not groomed to be king. That's important to know about him, because of, we know he was elected to the throne in rather unusual, well, or let's say, well, in constitutional circumstances, but rather unexpectedly in some way. So and it had, of course, certain, I guess, some disadvantages, because some people like Queen Emma and her supporters kind of questioned his ability or his lineage and all that. But at the same time, it had a lot of advantages too, because he was kind of a common citizen. Well, not just a regular common citizen. Surely he was of ali'i rank, but he was just like, a government official, a high-ranking government official. So he could kind of see the inner workings of the government and also civil society. So he had various jobs in Hawaiian society before he was even considered to become king. And that, I think, also sharpened his instincts and sharpened his mind and his political abilities. So some things, he was in the 1860s a newspaper editor. He was one of the co-editors of the newspaper Kahoko Okapaki Pika. That is a very important paper, because this is the first newspaper Hawaii that was entirely free of American missionary influence. So I'm not saying the missionaries controlled everything. That's of course wrong, but at the same time, it is true that the mission press was of course the first one printing newspapers, and then even when the Hawaiian government started printing their newspapers, most of the editors were actually former American missionaries. So there was always kind of a certain influence of kind of missionary agenda in Hawaiian language newspapers until 1860, at least to some extent. And then with that one, for the first time, it was just like, it was just a group of Kanaka or Iwi running their own paper. And that's also when really the, this kind of, in a way, that really the start of the cultural renaissance during that time too, because they made it a point to publish traditional Hawaiian mo'olelo in their newspaper. And a lot of them, like all kind of things that previously were like, it was rather kind of marginalized. A lot of the newspapers previously, they were just either news or sometimes kind of Christian texts, and then this one, had just a lot of kind of literary and cultural kind of content that was like based on traditional Hawaii, and therefore also, safeguarding oral traditions by writing them down and all of that, which is well known. But really, the Ho'okopaki Pika is the start of that, and then other newspapers picked up that format. So really, a very, very important kind of juncture in the development of Hawaiian journalism, and Kalakaua was right there at the beginning of that. And I have to acknowledge here also Noinoi Silva, who in her book has pointed that out really well, how important that paper was in Hawaii's history. Now, in talking about the government, he was also a privy councillor under Kamehameha V, so he was kind of really in the inner circle of running the country. And also Postmaster General. So this building still stands today. It's the post office that was built during Kamehameha V's reign. And so, yeah, here just as an example, you see some of the stamps from the Hawaiian Kingdom, one with Kamehameha IV and one with King Kalākaua. Interestingly enough, these stamps don't correspond to the reigns of these monarchs, because Hawaii found kind of the Victorian format to have just the monarch on every stamp. They found that kind of boring, right? Like British stamps, they have like, they have just Queen Victoria. Maybe sometimes she's like looking to the right or to the left or whatever, or like green and blue and whatever, but it's always the same thing, pretty boring. Hawaii thought, no, we're just gonna put like all the main ali'i, and we just like alternate their portraits. So you had Kalakaua actually on Hawaiian stamps even before he became a king. You had the Princess Liliuokalani already on certain denominations of stamps before she became queen, and even during Liliuokalani's reign, you still had like portraits of Kalakaua, of Kamehameha V, and others for certain denominations. So it was always kind of a very interesting kind of mix of various ali'i on those Hawaiian stamps. But anyway, it's just like I'm a coin collector. Well, coin as well, but I'm a stamp and coin collector, so it's particularly interesting in those kind of things about Hawaiian history. But anyway, so just to make a point here that Kalakaua had various experiences both in, I guess, in civil society as a journalist and in the government. So that really trained him probably particularly well to then take the, to become head of state. Now, unfortunately, we still have to think about one regrettable interlude right before his reign, and that was during the reign of Lunalilo. So Kamehameha V died without an heir. And as far as I understand, he pretty much preferred already that Kalākaua would become his successor because he trusted him. There was one of his inner circle advisors. He thought that Kalākaua would continue his policies well and all of that, but Kalākaua was of lower rank, where Lunalilo was of much higher rank, and so the people preferred Lunalilo, and most of the legislators preferred Lunalilo. So it was pretty clear that Lunalilo would become the successor because of his popularity. And now, unfortunately, Lunalilo was, he was very popular. He also was probably, I think, very kind-hearted, but I don't think he was as politically savvy as either Kamehameha V was or Kalākaua was. So I don't think he was really the right person in terms of savviness and political acumen for that position. So I'm not so much criticizing his own personal policies, which I think were all good and well intended, but he just surrounded himself by the wrong people. And one of the worst people he surrounded himself with was Charles Reed Bishop, who Lunalilo appointed foreign minister. And Charles Reed Bishop, unfortunately, even though I know there's some people at KS, well, not all, unfortunately, but some people at KS are still putting him on a pedestal as being like a great benefactor to Hawaii or whatever. But I mean, it's all complete nonsense. Charles Reed Bishop was a greedy businessman and had absolutely no respect for anything Hawaiian from the very start of his career. And he was, from the very beginning, he was scheming to have Hawaii taken over by the United States, probably to further his own business and banking interests, most likely. And so as foreign minister, he did tremendous damage to Hawaii because he tried to completely refocus Hawaii's foreign relations to the United States. And one of the things was he shut down all these Hawaiian consulates that had been opened under Kamehameha V, especially in Oceania, in various Pacific islands. And St. Julian was no longer there, but his successor, Edward Reeve, who had maintained this position of being like the Hawaiian diplomatic agent to coordinate like Hawaiian influence throughout Oceania and negotiate with all these different island states. Edward Reeve, he was being demoted to just being simply Hawaiian consul in Sydney, because Charles Reed Bishop didn't want any of this pan-Oceanian policy to be in any shape or form moved forward, because he wanted Hawaii to be annexed to the US, and just like that was his whole thing probably from the very beginning. Now, fortunately for Hawaii, this whole interlude lasted less than a year because Lunalilo passed away pretty soon, and then there was a new election, and of course we know what happened in that election. King Kalākaua was elected, the new king, elected to the throne on February 12th, 1874. So King Kalākaua, when he was elected, and that is very, very important. Well, one of the first things was, of course, he immediately fired Charles Reed Bishop from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then just merely 4 days after taking the throne, he started to reconnect and like rebuild all these things that Bishop had destroyed and that Kamehameha V had started to build, namely those relationships with other Pacific islands. And so, like I said, merely 4 days after taking the throne, he writes a letter to King Kalākaua of Fiji, who previously Kamehameha V had established close relations with, and also instruct the Hawaiian consul to resume these formal relations and also really support Fiji in the face of British imperialism and try to really help Fiji to defend its independence. Unfortunately, it was too late, because right during this kind of vacuum, when no support came from Hawaii, the British had kind of crept into Fiji, and they had essentially started a takeover, and then eventually compelled, Kalkaua and to sign over Fiji to become a British colony in late 1874. But still, it is as sad as it was. But it is interesting that, like, at the last minute, King Kalākaua, again, like as soon as he could, he like tried to step in and do something about that. So that's probably like the first act. Now, shortly thereafter, it turned the attendance or the attention of King Kalākaua was turned to Samoa. So just a little bit of a backstory. In 1873, so this was during Lunalilo's reign, in Hawaii, Samoan chiefs, pretty much just by themselves, no Hawaiian influence at that time, they had formed a centralized constitutional government. And these are some of the people here, like two of the high chiefs, Maletua Laupepa and Tupuata Masese Titimaya. Also some of the middle, lower ranking advisors, indigenous Samoan advisors, Selu and Lemamea. These were like, I think, the most important people in that Samoan government. And, collectively, they then reached out to an American diplomat and adventurer by the name of Albert Steinberger. And he, he again was one of those Americans who were actually playing like a good role in the Pacific. So again, we don't, we have obviously, especially people in Hawaii, for good reasons, have a lot of grudges against Americans. But we also need to always be aware that out of America also came people who did good things in the Pacific. And I'm not saying more than out of Britain or out of Germany or out of France or whatever, but I mean, nonetheless, it's like there's no black and white here. It's not like all Americans are doing bad things in the Pacific. But so Albert Steinberger for sure was one of these positive people, and he actually promised them American support, and also offered to negotiate on their behalf with the U.S. government, so that at that time the strategy of these Samoan chiefs was that they would get recognition by America, and then thereby they would get recognition by other powers, and therefore also create kind of an independent state, the same way that Hawaii had in 40 or 40 years earlier. Now, and then they actually appointed Steinberger to be premier. Now. 1 year later, like I said, Kalakaua got elected to the throne, and then Kalakaua in late 74 takes active interest in Samoa. Steinberger, because he's going back and forth between the US and Samoa, he always stops over in Honolulu, and each time he then confers with King Kalakaua. And King Kalakaua teaches him a lot about constitutional governance and other matters of statecraft in Oceania. So essentially, even though there's no Samoan at that point in Hawaii directly, but because Steinberger is commissioned by the Samoans, they trust him as their emissary, and he kind of, picks up a lot of this knowledge of Hawaiian statecraft and passes it on to Samoa. And at the same time, they formally ask King Kalakaua for recognition, and he does write them a official letter, which you see here, where he recognizes the Samoan government. And then also they start to negotiate between Steinberger and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Honolulu, they start a Samoan-Hawaiian friendship treaty. This is the only draft manuscript that exists in an archives in Samoa that I had took probably 5 years of my lifetime to finally go through all kind of channels to finally be able to find this, to see this manuscript. Now, unfortunately, again, this is kind of this whole project is being cut short because in 1876 the British invade Samoa, and again there's a conspiracy by certain British settlers, also some American settlers who don't like Steinberger, they don't like the pro-native policy that he does, and then eventually with this conspiracy of various European settlers who just don't like this kind of progressive Samoan state, they deport Steinberger, actually essentially kidnap him, and then the whole Samoan government then collapses, and the whole project fails for the time being. So, but again, Hawaii had like an important part in trying to help to build something there. Now, of course, also the result of Hawaiian policy, both under Kamehameha V and the early period of Kalakaua, is that Hawaii is really becomes really well established as a model in the region, and we have these 3 constitutions in Fiji 1871 and 1873, Samoa 73, 75, and then finally Tonga 1875, and they are all based on the Hawaiian Kingdom Constitution. The very interesting is the one in Tonga, because in Tonga we still have, I mean, the other countries got colonized in various ways and, like, you know, had a different trajectory of the history, but Tonga still has this constitution with obviously a lot of amendments, but today's constitution of Tonga is still about, I would say, maybe 70–80% or so identical with the 1864 constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So that is kind of a very important thing, and people in Tonga today are also pretty much aware of that. So that is like an important legacy. Well, now talking about Tonga, after having copied Hawaii's constitution, a couple of years later, the you know, Tupou the First, who also has a Westerner, Haole guy, or Palangi, as they would say, as a chief advisor, Shirley Baker, and now he, in the name of the king, reaches out and writes a letter to the Hawaiian government that Tonga also wants to have a treaty of friendship, and they want to have it modeled on treaties that Hawaii had already done with Britain and Germany. So again, it's very interesting. Again, there's this awareness here that Hawaii is a power in the Pacific, not just these Western powers from the outside, but that Hawaii is, like, it's very important if you want to establish yourself as an independent country, which Tonga was on its way of doing. You need Hawaii to support you as well, and that's what they did. And now Hawaii Kalākaua responded very positively, and the Hawaiian government wrote back. But unfortunately, at that time, again, there were trouble in Tonga. Tonga was not as stable as Hawaii. There was all kind of internal problems. Actually, certain people tried to assassinate Baker at that time, and other troubles. So it looks like Tonga was unable to follow up, and because of that. And again, it was kind of a, you know, it was an attempt, and it was kind of initiated, but, you know, it was kind of stuck, and it didn't move on. But nonetheless, the precedent was there, and it was, I guess, something to be picked up later, which I'm going to get into in a little bit. Now, also during that time, it was really during Kalakaua's reign then that the Hawaii had, first of all, it had its highest number of diplomatic representatives all over the world. They were at the climax in 1887, before the bayonet coup. There were 103 Hawaiian embassies and diplomatic posts around the world. And out of these, there were quite a few in the Pacific. So I just want to go through some of these here by their stamps that I found in various archives, both in Hawaii and in some of the island states. So first we have here in Australia, Kanikele Hawaii ma Sydney. Then we have Kanikele Hawaii ma Tasmania. Then we have this red one. It's hard to read here. It's the Hawaiian consul in Newcastle. Newcastle is well, there are various cities in the British Empire with that name, but this one is north of Sydney in Australia, between Sydney and Brisbane, kind of halfway. And then we also have on the far upper right, we have Auckland, Kanikele Hawaii ma Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Then here on the bottom, we have, this is actually the original, like the stamp, you know, this the negative that you make the stamp with, right? You make the seal with, that's why it's inverse. Kanikele Hawaii ma Fiji. And then the yellow one, hard to read, is Hawaiian Consulate in Samoa. And then we have this ink stamp here, which is in French, Hawaiian Consulate in Tahiti, at that time already under French rule. And then finally, we have one even in Micronesia. It says Hawaiian Commercial Agency. Now, commercial agency sounds like it's private and it's economic, but actually the term commercial agency was the lowest rank of a consular agency, right? So it is like, even though they use the term commercial, I guess because they're mainly concerned with commercial relations, but it's nonetheless not a private, but it's a public, it's a government position. It's a diplomatic office, right? And it was in Jaluit, Marshall Islands. So that's Hawaii's connection to Micronesia as well. Now, I guess Kalakaua's reign can be probably divided into three parts. Like the third is the one after the bayonet, which I'm not really talking too much about, which is the sad part. But then the the parts before is really, I guess, really we can divide it into like before his world trip and then after his world trip. And the world trip is really one of the, I think, central events in his life. And this is also really the event in which Hawaii again wrote world history, because Kalakaua was the first head of state in the world to do a trip around the world. Of course, nowadays every prime minister or president of pretty much almost every country will probably do this once on his term, because with jets it's pretty easy to do. It takes like a few hours, I mean, well, a few days maybe, but at that time, of course, it was very expensive and it took a long time. It took pretty much almost the entire year of 1887. So very few heads of state could either afford it, either financially or also like out of political expediency. They were worried that the coup would like depose them if they were absent for too long, and all of these things. So it was a hard thing to do, but Kalakaua did it, and he thereby wrote world history. And now, like you can see on this map, he went first to various countries in Asia: Japan, China, Siam, Hong Kong. Then he went to British India. Then he went through Egypt, and then to various European countries, pretty much all the major ones: Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Great Britain, Spain, Portugal. So of course Europe was important because these were the world powers at the time. But I think the most passionate and the most impressed Kalakaua really felt in the Asian countries, especially in Japan. And that's the picture up there where he's sitting together with various government officials of the Empire of Japan. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of him and the Meiji Emperor. I wish that was just one day surface from the archives, but maybe nobody ever took the picture, because I don't know, even of Emperor Meiji as a whole, there are very few photographs, even about just common kind of Japanese historiography. There's like, not very few portraits of Emperor Meiji. But anyway, but it is known from other sources that Emperor Meiji gave Kalakaua like the highest honors he ever gave to any visitor to Japan. Namely, he let him like walk beside him and not one step behind, like he would every other, both domestic Japanese officials and also foreign visitors, because they were all considered lower in rank than him. But for Kalakaua, no, he actually accepted him to walk at the same level when they were like inspecting a military parade in Tokyo. And the reason he did it is because Emperor Meiji considered, just like all Japanese emperors, considered himself to be a descendant of the gods, right, of the sun goddess Amaterasu. And because Kalakaua, through the Kumulipo, also claimed descendants from the gods, from the Hawaiian gods, from Papa and Wakea, and so on and so forth. And therefore, Emperor Meiji respected that. So he saw like the connection. Here's another non-European monarch who descends from the gods. So therefore, they kind of he had this kind of equal respect. And on the other hand, Kalakaua was really impressed by Japan in the sense that we have another non-European country that is like modernizing, that creates kind of a modern state, and will at that time wasn't recognized yet by the West, but at one point would be. And so that was really like in many ways a model for Kalakaua, but also Hawaii being recognized was a model for Japan. So it was again mutual in a way. And then similar in other countries, in China, in Siam, even in Egypt, like all these countries that were like non-European and were in one way or another discriminated against by Westerners for being non-white people. And so Kalakaua thought that he developed this idea that there should be like these non-Western countries should bond together and form like a coalition of like Asian or Asia Pacific, or just like Asian and African, like various ways of that. But he was really like envisioning that. Another kind of very close relationship is that during his trip, he met the Maharaja Abu Bakar of Johor, which is nowadays part of Malaysia. And when they met, both rulers recognized that they have common cultural and linguistic roots, which today would be called Austronesian, right? Austronesian languages, there's a language group that both the Polynesian languages belong to, but also the languages of Southeast Asia. Malay, Indonesian, Filipino languages belong to that group. And there's a lot of words that are actually similar in those languages between, let's say, Hawaiian and Malay. And they were able to, they were immediately recognizing that, even if they had two different kind of, I guess, outside religious affiliations, right? Kalakaua was raised as a Christian. Abu Bakr, just like his Arabic name already says, was a Muslim, like most of the rulers of Southeast Asia are or were. But besides that, besides being kind of, being influenced by two different kind of outside religious and cultural systems, they recognized that their own like indigenous heritage is actually very closely related. And Walter Murray Gibson, who was later would become King Kalākaua's Minister of Foreign Affairs. At that time, he was a newspaper editor, very favorable to King Kalākaua. He wrote that, this quote here, His Majesty recognized striking evidence of kinship between Hawaiian and Malay. And then King Kalākaua himself said about the Maharaja, if he could have spoken our language, I would take him to be one of our people, the resemblance being so strong. Yeah, so there you see like this, this, again, this is very important for the psychology of Kalākaua, because he realizes also that, the Europeans always telling him, or like the Westerners, the Americans, the missionaries, all these people always saying, oh, the Hawaiians, it's just like a very small people, they're all going to die soon and of the diseases. And it's like, this is like these tiny, the Polynesians are so few people, they don't matter in the world. It's like a tribe that's lost somewhere in the small islands. And then Kalākaua realizes, no, it's actually like, he's related to like the Malay people. It's like 100 million already at that time, or maybe even more. And, that like there's a lot of connections that Hawaiians have, even like genetically and culturally, to other peoples in the world as well. And, again, this is, I guess, probably was helping him to strengthen his commitment and his identity and his dedication to, stand up for his people and for his culture and for his heritage. And that's exactly what he did, because when he came home, being so impressed by what he saw, he had this kind of, pretty much these two policies that came hand in hand. One, the so-called Hawaiian Renaissance, namely the revival of Hawaiian cultural practices. So many of you know that, right? I mean, you have the hula that came back as a major kind of part of ceremonies of state, like I think 2 or 3 days in a row of hula that were performed for his coronation in 1883. This is a picture of that. Also, that he published the Kumulipo. This is the original cover and first page of that. Now, this is of course also, I think, a fascinating way of selective appropriation, as some anthropologists call it, right? I mean, so the missionaries bring the printing technology to Hawaii in order to print Bibles and prayer books and those kind of things, right? To convert people with their foreign creed. And now King Kalākaua, just like he already did in the 60s with the newspaper, right? Kahoko Kapaki Pika, and now he takes to the next level. He actually takes like the printing press to actually print a religious text, a Hawaiian religious text that is non-Christian, and uses that technology that the missionaries brought actually in order to convert people and to import another foreign religion into Hawaii. So I think this is like, really like congenial ways of using that modern technology to bring back kind of, a cultural renaissance. And we have also the Halinawa Society, which Kalakaua founded, which is I guess again as a syncretistic way of combining both the traditional styles of organization, right? Halinawa originally was the group of experts of people who would validate genealogies of ali'i before their internalization. And so that's one part, but also he was a Freemason, so he was also involved by this kind of Western style of kind of esoteric Western culture coming through Freemasonry, and he was kind of combining that into this Halinawa or Temple of Science organization that he had, kind of was associated with the palace and with him and his close circle of friends. Now, while there was this cultural revival at home, this is also being mirrored by a more assertive foreign policy, and so you can really see how these cultural considerations now start to influence his policy making. And before we go into that, let me just briefly go over some of the supporters, because Kalakaua, as great as he was, nobody can do a great politics and great statesmanship just by himself. So you need a team of people. And so just wanted to also highlight and honor some of the people who were his supporters and who were loyal to him. So I have just a list here. This is not exhaustive. This is just like the seven, 1, 2, 3, 4. Sorry, 6. So 6 Oiwi on one side and 6 Haole on the other that come to my mind. But it's, like I said, the list is not exhaustive. So we have on the Oiwi side here, you have John Kapena, who was Minister of Foreign Affairs for a long time. John Edward Bush, newspaper editor, politician, and then also Minister of Foreign Affairs at one point. Also ambassador to Samoa. We'll get into that in a little bit. Curtis Iokea, Chamberlain, and also then chief diplomat. He's being sent abroad by King Kalākaua around the world again for a follow-up trip. Henry Poor, another diplomat who is first the assistant to Curtis Iokea on his trip around the world, and then later he's the assistant to John Bush in Samoa, so like a very key person for diplomacy. And then the two half-brothers, Robert Huapili and John Tamatoa Baker, who are also important people in the Hawaiian government and also very supportive of his Kalakaua's Pan-Pacific policy. And John Tamatoa Baker is very interesting too, because he actually continues that policy. He lives until the early I don't know exactly when he passed, but in 1907, so a couple of years into the occupation already, he does another trip to the Pacific to travel through all these different Pacific islands to, in a way, like, continue Kalakaua's Pan-Pacific diplomacy, even if he's now a private citizen and he's, no longer obviously has that direct diplomatic influence. But it's almost kind of like a pseudo or like a para-diplomatic effort, I think, what he did. And again, I have to acknowledge another person here, another researcher, Kealani Cook, who has found out about Tamatoa Baker and his trip. Like, I think without him, we would probably not even know about that. So again, acknowledge him here. On the Haole side, we have some people. We have Charles Harris. You already mentioned him. He was because he was a lawyer from New England. He was also very influential especially when Kalakaua was young and was a government official. Charles Harris trained him in the law. So a lot of the kind of legal knowledge that Kalakaua had that was important to as a government official and as a head of state, he gained from Charles Harris. Henry Sheldon, unfortunately, I didn't find a picture. He was a newspaper editor, and he was writing very favorably during the early reign of Kalakaua. He was a very loyal journalistic supporter who wrote in English about Kalakaua's policies and tried to explain what was happening there and why it's important to do this Pan-Pacific policy to English readers. But he also had a half Hawaiian son who then later wrote the famous biography of Joseph Navahi in the late 1800s. So the Sheldon family is quite important. Then we have William L. Green. He is more of a complex character because, as far as I can tell, he was very supportive initially. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and as far as I can tell, he was loyal and doing good things for Kalakaua. He was also working with the Halanawa Society, so he was sharing scientific knowledge because he was also a scientist. So he was in many ways, I think, a good supporter. But then I don't know what happened, but after 1887, he became part of the Bayonet Gang and actually was part of those guys. So I guess initially he was on the right side. Later, unfortunately, not. But I have keep him here because in the early part, I think he was indeed an important supporter. And of course, we have Walter Murray Gibson, who is maybe one of the most important of the Haole advisors. He supported him through newspaper articles very early on. He campaigned for him during his campaign to the throne, and then he became Minister of Foreign Affairs and was really one of the main co-authors, I guess, of Kalakaua's Pan-Pacific policy in the 1880s. Similar to Cesare Moreno, that was an Italian. He was in the early 80s. He was also advising King Kalakaua and also a supporter of a Pan-Pacific policy. And Finally, Joseph S. Webb, he is a British subject from the Australian colonies, but he also played an important role in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during the Pan-Pacific policy in the 1880s. So another person. So these are just some important people here. But finally, I think an important aspect that, you know, for King Kalākaua is also artists. He, you know, arts was an important aspect of him. It was not just politics, but also arts, like the cultural revival, the cultural renaissance went hand in hand. And there were also two very important people here, Isobel and Joseph Strong. They were the most important court artists of Kalākaua. So Isobel was really an avant-gardist, an artist who was like really beyond, like, you know, I would say ahead of her time. You see this menu that she drew, like this menu chart, very kind of Art Deco style. So from the 1880s, this is really almost ahead of its time. You would probably date this more like 1910s or so. Like it's very like extremely modern kind of artwork for the time. And she also designed the Royal Order of the Star of Oceania, Kahoku Oceania. I'll get into that in a little bit, but she designed it too. And then her husband Joe, he painted famous landscapes. For example, this one of the fishermen in Waikiki, and he also was a photographer, and he documented the diplomatic mission to Samoa that I'm going to talk about in a little bit through his photographs. Well, then in the when we get more into the 1880s, the connections to other Pacific islands increase. Now in 1882, 1883, we have correspondence with Kiribati or the Gilbert Islands, as they were called then. So we have two kings or chiefs of two of these atolls who petition King Kalākaua. They write a letter to him, and they actually ask him for Hawaii to annex their country, or at least proclaim a protectorate. So, you know, we're talking about annexation as like something Western powers do to Pacific islands to take them over, but we also have here this idea that Hawaii actually should annex other islands, and that leaders of those islands want that to happen. And I guess if you think about it, like these were small atolls, they were very vulnerable, and you know, you just needed one European ship. Didn't even have to be a warship, just like a merchant ship that was well armed, and they could do like a lot of damage there. They could kidnap people to enslave them. They could rape women. They could, like, all these things happen, right? Like with Europeans being let loose, or Westerners, how the people being let loose onto Pacific islands at the time. And so I guess having like a comparatively much stronger country like Hawaii, which had, you know, at least a few ships and at their own, under their flag, and had like, you know, had you know, much more manpower, you know, about 100,000 people, and you know, it was, I guess it would make sense to some of these small atolls to ally with Hawaii, or to even be annexed by them and become part of the Hawaiian kingdom, and therefore protect their people better. So that was probably their motivation. And because they did have bad experiences with slave traders in the 1860s, coming and kidnapping a lot of people from their islands. And so Kalākaua writes back. He wrote a letter back in Hawaiian, which you see on the right hand side, and he is very interesting. He already kind of acknowledges that he is kind of going to rule over other Pacific islands soon, because he self-identifies as Mo'i o Kuhawai Pai Aina Amerikai Mau Ailana Polynesia, like king of the Hawaiian Islands and of some other islands in Polynesia. Now he does, however, refuse to do this annexation, because obviously he doesn't really know what he's getting his country into by doing that, right? I mean, it makes sense. You have to first check and examine and investigate this issue. But he does invite those two chiefs to come and attend his coronation at Iolani Palace, and want to discuss these things with them further. Now, unfortunately, I think there is a certain error of judgment there on Kalākaua's part, because these people, these chiefs on these small atolls, they just didn't have the power, they didn't have the resources to do a trip on a boat like a couple thousand miles away and attend the coronation in Honolulu. So they didn't come because they didn't have the means to do that. Plus, their own societies were probably not stable enough that they would keep the chiefly position if they were absent for like a couple of months from there. Then some cousin would just take over, you know. So all of that, Kalākaua and his supporters were probably not really fully aware of, unfortunately. So these guys never came, and then this whole thing kind of, I guess, again, didn't really go further. But in 82, yet another Gilbertese or Kiribati chief, Binoka of Abemama, he again petitioned Kalākaua, and this time actually much more serious stuff. He wants them to give him arms and support him militarily, so that he could conquer the other islands of Kiribati and become the Kamehameha of Kiribati. Now, that again, Kalākaua was, not directly reacting to, because again, he didn't want to get involved in wars somewhere else and stuff like that. But again, this again shows how Kalākaua was being appreciated, and how Hawaii was seen as a power in the world that could actually matter in the region. So instead, what Kalākaua did, he sent Alfred Tripp, another a ship captain who was I think he was a Hawaiian national of British origin, I think, he was commissioned to be a Hawaiian diplomatic emissary, and he was sent to examine and just investigate and follow up and meet with all these different Gilbertese chiefs on these atolls and follow up. Now again, we have unfortunately here, again, a bad fate here, I guess, because the mission is aborted because Tripp's ship crashes on a reef on one of these atolls there. So they have to pretty much give up this whole thing and return home. But yet again, there's like, the effort is there. So I guess what we're seeing here is a constant will of other Pacific Islanders to have Hawaii be involved as a protecting power for them. And we have also will of Kalākaua, especially, to do something about it and actually take up that kuleana. It's just like always some bad circumstances prevented from like fully taking off. Now, all this being said, in 1883, Kalākaua and Gibson, who is now Minister of Foreign Affairs, and again become Kalākaua's probably closest and most trusted and most personal advisor, they draft this protest and send it to all European powers in the world, and they protest against the colonization of the Pacific Islands, essentially saying that, look, these islands should be left alone. None of you guys should take them over, because look at us, we have developed into like a perfectly recognized modern state in Hawaii, and you recognize us, and we should give all these islands, with our own support and guidance, the chance to develop at the same, go through the same stages, also become internationally recognized independent states under Hawaiian guidance. So that's essentially what they are saying. And now this is interesting enough. It was written on parchment, not on paper. It was written in an ink that I'm not sure what kind of ink that is, because it just doesn't fade. I saw copies of this in the German archives, French archives, and the Dutch archives, and it really looks like it was written like yesterday. It's like amazing for like something from 1883. Most of the paperwork from that time has faded, the ink has faded, the paper has started to crumble, all that, but not this one. So, they spent a fortune in Honolulu to make this and send it to they took this very, very seriously. To send this to all countries in the world. Now, at the same time, closer to home, Kalākaua is realizing too that there's all this Pan-Pacific policy, but even the country itself is not really fully unified yet. In the sense of that, of course, the 8 islands are part of Kohawaii since a long time already, since Kamehameha I, but the island chain still has kind of gaps that are not, where the sovereignty is not clear, because most of these northwestern Hawaiian islands were uninhabited, and this was before modern archaeology, so you didn't have proof of Hawaiian settlement yet, like in olden times. So they were essentially considered empty, and they're uninhabited islands, and pretty much anybody who went there and put a flag could claim them under international law at that time. And so in 1886, Kalākaua sends Captain Colonel James H. Boyd on a Hawaiian ship on the Hawaiian Navy ship Manuo Kauai to just go through this whole island chain and to claim the rest of these islands that are not clearly under international law recognized as being part of Hawaii or the Hawaiian kingdom yet. And then so they go to the furthest end, the island Moku Papa, also known as Kure or Ocean Atoll or Island, and they formally claim that and put the Hawaiian flag on that. Now, we have a problem there, though, however, because the island before that, the second last in the chain, which is Midway, that one actually was claimed already by the United States. Again, under international law, that was a legal way because nobody lived there, and Hawaiian ancient connections were really a long time ago, and probably Americans didn't even know that. So the Americans had claimed it in 1867. As a potential future military base. They hadn't built it yet. That one would only be built in the 1920s, but the US had an internationally valid claim to Midway. But Kalākaua was really bothered by that because he figured he was sincerely convinced that the entire Pai'aina needs to be under Hawaiian sovereignty because these are all ancestral islands. He had just published he was working on the Kumulipo, hadn't published it yet, but was working on it, and he knew that, these islands have a very high spiritual significance. Maybe on top, he was also thinking about fisheries and just like the technical qualities of having a large maritime space. That was probably another kind of more, I guess, modern scientific reasoning, but certainly the spiritual and cultural reasoning was very strong that Midway the Pai'aina needs to be completely under Hawaiian control. And so he started to negotiate with the US State Department and told them that, we asked the Americans to give up that claim and turn that island over to Hawaii. And this was the first Cleveland administration. And Cleveland, as we know, was an isolationist, not an imperialist, not an expansionist. So the Cleveland administration was actually lending a positive ear to that, and they were starting to negotiate this turnover. So again, if Bayonet hadn't happened in mid-1887, probably Midway would have eventually been turned over to Hawaii, because that also didn't really have that important strategic significance to the US at that time. And during this non-imperialist administration, they were not that interested in keeping it. So, again, this is very far-sighted. Kalākaua really wants to make sure that the territorial integrity of the Pai'aina is intact. Now, in late 1887, then King Kalākaua founds the Royal Order of the Star of Oceania. Like I already mentioned, the designer. It's done in recognition of services, relating to the Pacific Ocean and Polynesia. And again, I have to acknowledge another friend of mine, Keahi Lee, who one day suggested to me, which I never thought about, but that this is actually a very close reference probably to the newspaper title, because remember Kahuku Okapaki Pika, right? The Star of the Pacific. And on this order, it says Kahuku Oceania, the Star of Oceania. So very, very similar. And of course, Pakipika and Oceania mean essentially the same thing. So probably he came up with that name. I mean, don't have the proof, but very likely he saw this also as an extension of what he previously had done with his newspaper back before he became king. So that's kind of my theory of how he came up with that specific name. Now, if you look at the statues of that order, they're very interesting too. I have them here, Makaʻolelo Hawaii, and in English. In the interest of not going on forever here, I will not read the Olelo Hawaii. For those of you who Olelo Hawaii, you can of course pause this and then just read it, but I will just read aloud here the English version. It says, the Star of Oceania, the Order of the Star of Oceania is hereby established for the recompense of distinguished services rendered to us or to our state, and in advancing the name and influence of Hawaii amongst the native communities of the islands of the Pacific and Indian Oceans and on contiguous continents. I think two things are striking here. First of all, his definition of Oceania is not just islands to the south in the Pacific, but also islands all the way to the Indian Ocean, which has to do obviously with his experience in Malaysia during his trip around the world, where he noticed that the Malay people of Southeast Asia are also closely related and are also Oceanians, in more or less, to him, and even all the way to Madagascar. There's some correspondence with Madagascar as well at one point. I'm not going into this here, but Madagascar is close to Africa, to East Africa, but it's also Austronesian speaking, has a language very closely related to Indonesian and Malay. So essentially he thinks about like this entire like Indo-Pacific, I guess, as we use the term today. He thinks of that as like being kind of the Oceania in which Hawaii should play a leading role. Also interesting is that he doesn't talk about states or nations, but he talks about the native communities. So that, I think, again, is something that's really important and ahead of its time, that, you know, we're talking about indigenous rights, indigenous communities, and all of that. And, you know, again, here we have King Kalākaua 130 or 140 years before us, and he is essentially creating a very similar discourse here, that it's not, the main thing is not states and nations, even though he obviously is proud to be the head of one of those that is recognized, but he also extends this idea of pan-Oceanianism and of international relations, not just to states that are recognized, but also to native communities, like, or as we today would say, indigenous communities. So that, I think, is very important to think about. Okay, now finally, that being said, he, after having founded that order, he now finally gets to put this theory to practice. And in early 1887, he sends an Hawaiian diplomatic embassy consisting of Edward Bush and Henry Poor, and also the Hawaiian warship Ka'imiloa, the first Navy ship that is like, you know, a full Navy ship. And they sent them to Samoa in order to defend Samoa's independence against Western imperialism, because at that time Samoa is, like I said, ever since this British intervention of 1876, when they destroyed the first Samoan government, Samoans are struggling, trying to form their kingdom modeled on Hawaii, but the Western powers are constantly interfering and like messing it up in one way or another during that time. And in order to strengthen Samoa and put it back on the path of developing towards a kingdom based on Hawaii, that's one of the reasons they sent the Hawaiian diplomatic embassy. And here you see on board the Ka'imiloa, you see Malietoa, that's the one with a feathered bicorn hat, and the big epaulets, and on his breast he wears the Royal Order, the Grand Cross of the Royal Order of the Star of Oceania that he had just been awarded. Then next to him, Bush, also with the bicorn hat, and then Henry Poor further to the right. So these are the two Hawaiian diplomats. And then on the other hand, you see 3 naval officers of the Ka'imiloa, Hawaiian naval officers who were also part of that team. And just within a very short time, in February 1887, then Malietoa and the King of Samoa, Malietoa Laupepa, and Bush, as a Hawaiian ambassador, they send a treaty of political confederation. This is the original, the Samoan ratification copy of it in the state archives in Honolulu. And this is, again, a very important thing, because we are talking about, those of you who follow like occupation discourse and the things Keanu is doing, and other people, that, you know, we have a very strong argument that the treaties that the Hawaiian Kingdom signed were never canceled. And so this is, of course, important in relations with Switzerland, Belgium, France, other European powers, and it's, you know, it's being tested. It has been tested in certain cases, and it is being tested. But we also have that for Samoa. So again, this treaty was never canceled. So again, Samoa is actually under international law in a treaty of confederation, is in a political confederation with Hawaii. So that is an important thing too, that you know, I don't know what we can do out of that practically right now, but it is certainly something that at one point probably will somebody will get back to, and it will have some very interesting implications. So this is really, so here really we have the start of this Polynesian Confederation. It was not a dream of Kalakaua. It was something that the first step was actually done, and it was signed. At least we have two countries in this confederation, Hawaii and Samoa. Now the problem is, of course, like I said, Samoa is not the same society as Hawaii. It doesn't have really a centralized kingdom. It has like various high chiefs with high ranks, and they are it's a very complex system that is kind of very decentralized and has a lot of these village councils that play an important role, and chiefly titles that are not inherited but that are awarded by village councils. So it's a very complex system that's not as centralized as Hawaii is or was traditionally. So taking that into account, both the Kaimiloa and these two Hawaiian diplomats, they have to really travel around and have various meetings, like very lots of meetings in various villages, to make sure that all these village councils are on board of that and that they all consent to this Polynesian Confederation, because Malietoa's signature alone is not really that, doesn't really count that much. We need to implement it on the ground, and they do that here. So here's one of the meetings that they have in the village of Lufi with Mata'afa, one other high-ranking chief, probably the second highest in rank after King Malietoa. Now, the Polynesian Confederation then goes further because, or is planned to go further. Now, Bush is also instructed to then continue to go to Tonga and deliver a letter from Kalākaua to George Tupo. Unfortunately, the only copy we have is this typescript. And then, so they're supposed to conclude this friendship treaty that they had, like, to follow up with this 1880 aborted negotiations to have a treaty. And then, but also, besides a bilateral treaty, they also want to invite Tonga to actually join the Polynesian Confederation and be part of it, and then extend it to include Hawaii, Samoa, and Tonga. Then the next is all in Bush's diplomatic instructions, is that he should then continue to the Cook Islands. Here's one of the leading chiefs there, Queen Makea Takau of Rarotonga. And so he's supposed to go there and then also negotiate with them to join the Confederation. Then finally, he's also to follow up with this aborted diplomatic mission of 1883, and also follow up with the chiefs of Kiribati, and again, either invite them to the Confederation or annex them actually all the way to Hawaii, according to what some of them had previously requested. So anyway, he's supposed to go there and check that out and just like follow up with that there as well. So that's pretty much where we were, and then unfortunately it all ends, and that is because we have two sad events that happen almost concurrently, and that is like essentially the German Navy and American missionary sons in Honolulu. These are the ones, these are the culprits. They are then essentially destroying the Polynesian Federation. So in Germany, in Samoa, Germany threatens to declare war against Hawaii because they say that they are interfering in Samoa, which is of course ridiculous because they come from the other side of the world, and if anybody interferes in Samoa, it's the Germans. Hawaii is not interfering; they're just helping their Polynesian brothers. But here you see that there's the Kaimiloa in the front, and in the back you see the two German warships kind of lurking in the back, so kind of ready to attack essentially. And that's pretty much what they do. And in August 1887, they really invade and occupy Samoa. They kidnap Malietoa, take him to Germany. And then they install a pro-German rival to be a puppet king. So that's pretty much what ends this implementation on the ground in Samoa. At the same time, in Hawaii, they have also in the summer of 1887, they have the, what's called as the bayonet coup missionary party. The same people who then got involved in the overthrow a couple of years later, like Thurston, Dole, W.D. Alexander, all these people, Sereno Bishop, like all these names that we know of, Charles Reed Bishop in the back funding it all. So these people they do a coup d'etat against Kalakaua, and they have their militia, the Honolulu Rifles, which they don't have in 1893. They don't have that anymore, so that's why they need American military navy to invade and do that for them. But in 1887, they do have their own militia, and they do conduct that coup and then force Kalakaua to sign that bayonet constitution, where he has to give up most of his powers. And the new cabinet under the bayonet constitution then immediately recalls the diplomatic mission from Samoa and completely terminates this pan-Polynesian policy like once and for all. So that's how this unfortunately ends. Right when it was like starting to flourish, it gets unfortunately ended. However, Kalakaua is not completely dispirited by that because he continues to be interested in reconnecting with Oceania. And I have found a very interesting document in the French archives because in 1887, Kalakaua was actually planning to visit Tahiti and reconnect relations with the royal family there. So the situation in Tahiti is that King Pomare V is still king, but it's already under French overrule. So the French are already in Tahiti pretty strongly implemented. But he is anticipating King Kalākaua to visit him. And so he writes to the French government and asks him for permission to create a royal order of Pomare. He actually has the design here attached to it. So it looks pretty nice. Because he anticipates that King Kalākaua will give him the royal order of the Star of Oceania, and he wants to have something to reciprocate. Now the French say, no, you can't. You gave up your country. You are a French colony now. We don't give you the right to do that. So unfortunately, again, it doesn't work out. But again, I think this is an important piece of evidence. Again, how the reputation of Kalākaua really kind of precedes him everywhere in the Pacific. And almost every Pacific ruler really wants to do something, wants to have some kind of relationship with Kalākaua. So that's how important his reputation was throughout the Pacific, and not just his, obviously, but Hawaii is down the Hawaiian Kingdom as a country. Now, to finish, I would like to just end in his own words. It's always easy to judge people both positively or negatively by other sources or anecdotal evidence or whatever, but I think it's always important to listen to the people themselves, what they say. So I just want to give him, give the floor to him for this ending here, and then have two quotes of him. One is in Tokyo when he meets the Meiji Emperor of Japan, and he says, "It is imperative for the countries of the East," in which he includes Hawaii, "to form a league to maintain the status quo in the East, in this way opposing the European countries. The time for action has come." So this is kind of this initial statement of where he thinks that all these non-Western countries need to bond together, because that's the only way of fighting against the European imperialists who want to just take over the entire world. And interestingly enough, this type of mana'o, which is later called Pan-Asianism, and there are a lot of intellectuals in Japan, in China, in other parts of Asia in the early 20th century who write kind of similar statements. So it is kind of but here again, we have Kalākaua. He's not even Asian, he's Polynesian, but he's pretty much the pioneer of this idea of Pan-Asianism that gets picked up like a couple of decades later by Asian intellectuals. So again, you see how far ahead of his time he was. And then finally, in 1889, this is of course after the bayonet coup, the propaganda already starts, right? Pretty much after 87, the propaganda against Kalākaua starts. I really recommend, by the way, reading Tiffany Ng's book about reclaiming Kalākaua, because that's really good analysis of how Kalākaua has been kind of systematically maligned by the people who did the bayonet coup against him. And they really tried to systematically damage his reputation. And they started right after 1887 to do that by various publications. And so one of the things they were trying to do is to blame Kalākaua and say he was an imperialist. They were just, again, I guess, trying to justify European or Western or American imperialism by saying, well, Kalākaua was just imperialism is just the way to go. Powerful countries take over smaller ones. So if America should do that to Hawaii, but it's the same thing because Kalākaua himself did it, right? He was trying to take over these small islands and become a Polynesian imperialist or a Hawaiian imperialist. So right, that was kind of the spin they were doing in order to justify their own imperialism. And Kalākaua already in 1889, when these rumors or these interpretations were being spread, especially in the American press, he was defending himself, and he was saying, no, this is actually not, this was altruistic, this was not a means of imperialism. And so here he said, of course did I send Bush, of course I did send Bush, like the Hawaiian ambassador to Samoa, but it was from a repeated call from Samoa, as well as all the other South Sea islands, a call of confederation or solidarity of the Polynesian race. our mission was simply a mission of philanthropy more than anything, right? So here you have like that very clear statement about the purpose of all of that. Now, before we end, I just want to talk a little bit about the legacy, because, you know, we might ask ourselves, like, what does this mean? Like, I mean, you know, this was like, it was like 140 years ago. Kalakaua passed away 131 years ago. But, you know, how much legacy is there? Of course, there's a legacy in Hawaii. We all know that. We know that hula wouldn't be what it is today. Hawaiian music wouldn't be what it is today without him. We have the Merry Monarch named in his honor. We have the palace that's still there as a symbol of Hawaii's sovereignty that he built. So his legacy in Hawaii is very clearly there. But what about the legacy of this pan-Polynesian, or this pan-Oceanian or pan-Pacific policy? Well, that one is there as well. And it came to my attention. I wasn't even fully aware of that before, but in 2011, the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister of Samoa, now retired, Tuila Epa Sa'ilela Mali'ilenga'oi, he spearheaded the formation of a international organization called the Polynesian Leaders Group that was like meant to have like people from the triangle of Polynesia, from the different countries and territories to meet annually and to kind of formulate common policies. They're especially involved in the issue of climate change, right? Because most Polynesian countries are small and relatively vulnerable in terms of their land masses. And some of them are atoll nations. They're just like Tuvalu or Tokelau, threatened by the sea level and all that. So for all these purposes, they created this Polynesian Leaders Group. And he was then interviewed by a journalist from the Samoan government newspaper, Savali. And, you know, maybe it's a coincidence, but I would say it was meant to be. The interview took place on November 28th on Laku Oko'a, right, on Hawaii's national holiday. And so when they asked Tuila Epa about, you know, where does this idea come from, that to federate or like to create this association of Polynesian countries, he said, it's not a new group, it's not a new idea. The idea of a Polynesian confederation dates back to the 1880s, over 100 years ago. It was the height of imperialism in the Pacific, and King Kamehameha, well, he meant Kalakaua, I guess he got that wrong. Maybe the journalist got it wrong, I don't know. Of Hawaii, King Pumare of Tahiti, Malietoa Laupepa of Samoa, and King George Tupou of Tonga agreed to set up a confederation of Polynesian states at the time. Envoys from Hawaii were received here in Apia, that's the capital of Samoa, where Bush and Poor and the Hawaiian Navy ship went to, and agreements were signed. Right, so here you have the awareness among another Polynesian leader of this policy. And the dating is important because if you think about it, we have Kealani Cook, who wrote about this in his book Kahiki, that came out, I think, in 2017. You have my own book, A Power in the World, that talks about that. It came out in 2019. So before this research from this recent research from Hawaii that focuses on these Hawaiian Pan-Pacific policy, before this research came out, the Prime Minister of Samoa made that statement. So obviously it was not influenced by recent academic research out of Hawaii, but it was like probably some deep-seated knowledge that people in Samoa kept of this, you know, probably through oral tradition and other means. So, you know, this is, I think, a very, very important and very, you know, how would I say that? You know, it's a very deep kind of impression here, right? That people, that this has been preserved and people are aware of this. You know, when the time comes, I guess it's being resurrected. And at that time, originally, Hawaii was not part of that. It was just the kind of Southern Pacific nations, both independent countries like Samoa, but in Tonga, but also overseas territories like dependent territories, colonies like French Polynesia was part of it, American Samoa as well. But Hawaii was not originally part of it. But a couple of years later, Hawaii did join, and this is like another meeting here, another a group portrait on the right and the left. I'm sorry, in the right corner, and there you have on the far left you have Kamana Opono Crab, who some of you in Hawaii might know. He was CEO of OHA at that time, and he is actually quite famous. Unlike your typical OHA bureaucrat, he was actually making big efforts to incorporate the whole occupation narrative into OHA's policy. And he, you know, he's famous. Some of you might know. He wrote a letter to the U.S. Secretary of State asking about, you know, the non-existing treaty and the fact that Hawaii is not part of the U.S. and that you know, all of this thing is kind of Hawaii's status is in limbo, and he got into big trouble for that, but is, I guess, also seen as a hero by many Hawaiians for that reason. And anyway, so he was the one who then became Hawaii's delegate for that group, that leaders group. So there we have, in a way, kind of, you know, the circle, you know, the circle closes eventually by Hawaii joining back into this, which originally Hawaii under Kalakaua had originally created. Well, I have talked for a long time, and I think that's it. Mahalo nui for listening to me, and again, I hope this was a useful contribution to honor Mo'i Kalākaua on the day of his passing. And I wish you, wherever you are, whoever you are listening to this, wish you all the best. And you know, I hope for that we can all make some good contributions in one way or another to resurrect King Kalākaua's vision and, you know, keep up his legacy and take it to the next level. Mahalo and aloha.